This evening, Andrea will introduce her concept of matricentric feminism, that the topic of mothers, mothering and motherhood is deserving of serious and sustained scholarly inquiry. The impact of Professor O'Reilly's research has been felt internationally, as I said, and through marvellously, and I also note tonight, new generations of scholars. This is most obvious at any conference you go to in terms of age groups and generations. It's quite wonderful. For ANU and the Gender Institute, Andrea's presence here tonight and the lecture is actually a groundbreaking initiative. So please welcome Professor O'Reilly.
Thank you so much. It is indeed an honor, privilege, and joy to be here. I created the organization and press and journal out of a basic need, which I'll be talking about, and that is largely what I call that motherhood is the unfinished business of feminism. And I've been a mother for 33 years, and I've been doing it that long as well. And what I'll be talking about here, and talk about much more length in the recent book that Denise mentioned, is that I think motherhood is the unforgotten, ignored woman of feminism. And it's about time to change that. And I'm hoping with my organization and my own research to play a little bit in that, that needed change. So I begin with a quote with Virginia Woolf from her very famous book, A Room of One's Own, published in 1929. And she says this: "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she's to write fiction." For me, this quote serves to situate and frame what I'll be exploring in this paper and what has been a passionate concern of mine over the past 3 decades as I've sought to do feminism as a mother and to do mothering as a feminist. Namely, mothers need a feminism of their own. Now, when I use the term mothers, I refer to individuals who engage in mother work, or what Sarah Ruddock has theorized as maternal practice. Such a term is not limited to biological mothers, but to anyone who does the necessary and important work of mothering as a central and important part of his or her life. Now, the aim of my recently published book, Matricentric Feminism, was to introduce this specific mode of feminism, what I have called matricentric feminism, and to document and detail how matricentric feminism is enacted in theory, activism, and practice. And the book in its final chapter also examines the relationship between matricentric feminism and the larger field of women's studies, or what I call academic feminism. Now, in this paper, mindful of time, I will introduce the concept of matricentric feminism and then examine what I call its disavowal and disappearance in academic feminism. So my work, both in my activism, my research, my teaching, and in my own mothering, works from one assumption: mothering matters, and it is central to the lives of women who are mothers. Now, in saying this, I'm not suggesting that mothering is all that matters, or that it matters the most. Rather, I'm suggesting that any understanding of mothers' lives is incomplete without a consideration of how becoming and being a mother shapes a woman's sense of self and how she lives and sees the world. As a motherhood scholar, a director of a research center on motherhood, an editor of a motherhood journal, and a publisher of a press on motherhood, I have talked to more mothers and read more motherhood scholarship than I think most. And I can say with complete confidence that for women who are mothers, mothering is a significant, if not a defining dimension of their lives, and that arguably maternity matters more than gender. Now, I do not seek to substantiate these claims, others have done that, but rather I take them as my starting point. Mothers need a feminism that puts motherhood at its center. Now, as I said in my opening remarks, mothering, it could be said, is the unfinished business of feminism. However, my work does not focus on why feminism has stalled for mothers. Again, others have done that well. Instead, my work positions mothers' needs and concerns as the starting point for a theory and politic on and for women's empowerment. Now, again, this repositioning is not to suggest that a matricentric feminism should replace traditional feminist thought. Rather, it is to emphasize that the category of mother is distinct from the category of women, and that many of the problems mothers face, whether they be social, economic, political, cultural, psychological, and so on, are, I can never say the word, specific to women's role and identity as mothers. Indeed, mothers are oppressed under patriarchy as women and as mothers. Consequently, mothers need a matricentric mode of feminism, organized from and for, as I said, their particular identity and work as mothers. Indeed, a mother-centered feminism is needed because mothers, arguably more so than women in general, remain disempowered despite 40 years of feminism. I use the term matricentric, which is a word I made up, by the way. You won't find it yet in any dictionary. I use the term matricentric feminism to define and describe this mother-centered mode of feminism. Now, in doing this, I borrow from feminist literary critic Elaine Showalter, who uses the term gynocentric to signify a woman-centered perspective. Similarly, I use matricentric feminism to convey a mother-centered perspective. Now, the choice to use matricentric over maternal and to use matricentric feminism instead of maternal feminism is deliberate. And it's done to distinguish a mother-focused feminism from a theory in politics of maternalism. Therefore, a matricentric perspective should not be confused with a maternalist one. Although some perspectives of matricentric feminism may be considered maternalist, they are largely limited to the activism of some motherhood organizations. Moreover, unlike a lot of maternalism scholarship, matricentric feminist understands motherhood to be socially and historically constructive and positions mothering more as a practice than an identity. As well, central to matricentric feminism is a critique of maternalist stance that positions maternity as basic only to women. As well, matricentric feminism challenges that this maternity is natural and innate only to women. Although matricentric feminism does hold a mother-centered perspective, it does not advance a maternalist argument or agenda. Thus, matricentric feminism marks the crucial difference between a focus on mothers from a politics of maternalism. Now, my use of the term matrifocal is drawn from a wonderful sociologist, Miriam Johnson, in her book, Strong Mothers, Weak Wives, published in '89. She says this, she's talking about matrifocal societies, and she writes, matrifocal societies tend to have greater gender equality because of the power of the maternal paradigm. In these societies, regardless of the particular type of kinship system, women play roles of cultural and social significance and define themselves less as wives and more as mothers. Matrifocality, however, does not refer to domestic maternal dominance so much as it does to the relative cultural prestige of the image of the mother, a role that is culturally elaborated and valued. Mothers are also structurally central to that society, and mothers have a degree of control over the kin's unit's economic resources, and they are involved in critical decision making. It's not the absence of males may be quite present, but the centrality of women as mothers that make a society matrifocal. So I'm using this concept of the matrifocal. A matrifocal perspective, therefore, is one in which mothers play a role of cultural and social significance, and in which motherhood is thematically elaborated and valued, and is structurally central to that perspective. In other words, and to draw on words of other literary critics, matrifocal narratives or perspectives begin with the mother in her own right, from her own perspective, and hold fast to a maternal perspective. So I may frequently asked, what is matricentric feminism? Because you can't look it up in any dictionary thus far. So in my book and here, I concede that as a new and emergent feminism, it is difficult to define matricentric feminism, other than to say that it is explicitly matrifocal, i.e. mother-centered and perspective emphasis. It begins with mother and takes seriously the work of mothering, and that it is interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. Now I'm going to gesture towards a possible definition by listing what I see as the central and governing principles and aims of this matricentric feminism. Okay, they are. Matricentric feminism asserts that the topics of mothers, mothering, and motherhood is deserving of serious and sustained scholarly inquiry. That seems self-evident, but trust me, as someone with 30 years in academia, that is anything but. It regards mothering as work that is important and valuable to society, but emphasizes that the essential task of mothering is not and should not be the sole responsibility and duty of mothers. It contests, challenges, and counters the patriarchal, oppressive institution of motherhood and seeks to imagine and implement a maternal identity practice that is empowering to mothers. It seeks to correct the child-centeredness that defines much of the scholarship and activism on motherhood, and seeks to develop research and activism from the experience and perspectives of mothers. It is committed to social change and social justice, and regards mothering as a socially engaged enterprise and as a site of power, wherein mothers can and do create social change through child rearing and activism. It understands mothering and motherhood to be culturally determined and variable, and is committed to exploring the diversity of maternal experiences across race, class, culture, ethnicity, sexuality, ability, age, and geographical location. Finally, it endeavors to establish maternal theory and motherhood studies as an autonomous, independent, and legitimate scholarly discipline. Now, this above list is obviously only partial and provisional. It's my hope that my work and those of many other matricentric feminists will lead to a more substantive and robust definition of this new feminist field of matricentric feminism. But overall, to borrow from New Zealander activist writer Marilyn Waring, matricentric feminism, to paraphrase her words, seeks to deliver a mode of feminism in which mothers and mothering count. So what I'm going to do in the remaining part is I'm going to now look at the relationship between this new field of feminism for and about mothers in relation to the already established field of what I call academic feminism. So my argument is quite simple, but I'm going to prove it, I hope. I argue that matricentric feminism has largely been ignored by mainstream feminist scholars and has yet to be incorporated into this field of academic feminism. Now, making this claim, I'm not saying no feminist scholarship on motherhood exists. That clearly is not the case for my press and journal alone, never mind the hundreds of other books. But rather, that matricentric feminism remains peripheral to academic feminism. As academic feminism has grown and developed as a scholarly field, it has incorporated various theoretical models and diverse perspectives to represent the particular concerns and experiences of groups of women, such as global feminism, queer feminism, third wave feminism, and womanism. In contrast, academic feminism has not recognized or embraced a feminism developed from and for the specific experiences and concerns of mothers. Now, the first section of this paper, I will look at first what I call the disavowal, I like that word, of motherhood in 20th century academic feminism, and then briefly look at its complete disappearance in 21st century academic feminism. Then I will prove my claims. I'm going to look at the 4 venues, the syllabi of Introduction to Women's Studies courses, articles and book reviews published in the leading women's studies journals, the content of Introduction to Women's Studies textbooks, and finally, papers presented at the National Women's Studies Association. They're the big North American Women's Studies Association that holds a very big conference every year and has done so since, I believe, the early 70s. So, and then the last bit of the paper is very speculative. I'm going to ruminate on possible reasons for the exclusion of matricentric feminism in academic feminism. And the 2 things I'm going to look at largely are confusing mothering with motherhood, and I'll explain that, and the conflation of matricentric feminism with gender essentialism. Okay, so the disavowal of motherhood in the last century, the 20th. In her 1986 book, A Lesser Life, Sylvia Ann Hewlett writes, Motherhood is the problem that modern feminists cannot face. She goes on to say, many contemporary feminists have reviled both mothers and babies. Some feminists rage at babies, others trivialize them. Yet few have attempted to integrate them into the fabric of a full and equal life. Now, significantly, Lori Umansky, in a book that came out 10 years after this, rebukes this claim by Hewlett. She says Hewlett is wrong. And this is what Lori Umansky says. Critics who accuse feminists of ignoring mothers or motherhood are not only wrong, but have completely missed the mark. Her book, she says, addresses what has emerged as what she calls a very vibrant and robust tradition of motherhood scholarship and feminism from the early 60s to the mid-80s. She argues that feminist discussions have subjected the institution of motherhood and the practice of mothering to their most complex, nuanced, and multifaceted analysis. Now, in this book, she traces this literature on motherhood that she says is there, beginning with what is called in feminist circles liberal and radical feminism of the 1960s, which was critical of motherhood but still talked about it, to what she calls a more celebratory view of motherhood in cultural feminism from the late 70s to the mid-80s. Okay, so her book concludes with this assertion. American feminists have long and vigorously debated the many issues that lie at the heart of motherhood. They might disagree over whether the bath is half empty or half full, but they have most decidedly not thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Now, I read Motherhood Reconceived when it was first published in '96, and I've read it many times since. Although I found Umansky's argument persuasive, it did not reflect my own experience of being a motherhood scholar in the field of academic feminism, or the experiences of the hundreds, if not thousands, of motherhood scholars I have met over the last 2 decades, plus as a motherhood researcher. Last year, Mercy celebrated its 20th anniversary, and Demeter Press its 10th anniversary. In those years, Mercy has hosted 51 international conferences and have published 38 journal issues, and Demeter has published 100 books. However, despite these many conferences hosted by our association and our journal and the books published by our press, not to mention all the other conferences and books on motherhood that have happened over the last 2 decades, I still hear, as I did 20 years ago at our first motherhood conference, stories from motherhood scholars about how their work has been ignored, dismissed, trivialized, or invalidated by academic feminists. I continue to hear how the women's studies courses they attend have few, if any, papers on motherhood, how motherhood is seldom a topic of discussion in women's studies classrooms and rarely included in academic feminist textbooks, and how articles on motherhood or reviews are all but absent in the leading women's studies journals. How can we, as mother academics, then, reconcile the exclusion experience we experience in academic feminism with Umansky's claim that feminist discussions have subjected the institution of motherhood and the practice of mothering to the most complete, nuanced, and multifaceted analysis? There's clearly a contradiction to what she is claiming to what I've experienced and thousands of other motherhood scholars. Now, I think it took me some time to work through that, but I think this disconnect between what Umansky is claiming and what actual mother scholars are experiencing is a result of two different historical periods and their particular view of mothering, as well as the important distinction between feminist writing and the discipline of academic feminism. Now, I agree with Umansky that from the mid-70s to the early 80s, mothering was explored, indeed, and celebrated in a lot of feminist writings. But the theoretical perspective of this writing, for those in women's studies will know these terms, was specifically that of what's been called cultural or difference feminism. A mode of feminism, however, that had largely gone out of favor by the 1990s and was not certainly taken seriously post-1990. Thus, in the mid to late 90s, when motherhood studies came into being, the mode of feminist theory that would have been receptive to this new scholarship, that of cultural feminism, had long fallen out of favor among academic feminists. As well, and I think most importantly, a distinction must be made between what has been written by feminists and what has been canonized in and by academic feminism. Again, I agree with Umansky that much was written on motherhood from the mid-70s to the late 1980s. But did these publications become the key texts in women's studies? Were they included in undergraduate courses or on graduate exam reading lists? My experience and those of the many motherhood scholars I've spoken to over the years suggest otherwise. Moreover, I contend that liberal feminism's negative view of motherhood has had a far greater impact on current thinking of motherhood than the celebratory view of mothering present in cultural feminism. Ask any student of women's studies, and I would venture that they are more likely to regard motherhood as the cause of women's oppression than as a site for women's empowerment. Now, my next section, moving 2 decades beyond Umansky's, I argue that in the 21st century, not only is motherhood viewed negatively, as it is with liberal feminism, but it has all but disappeared as a topic in academic feminism. In a wonderful review by Samira Kawash, published in Science about 8 years ago, this is what she argues, that beginning with Riches of Woman Born and until the late 1980s, there was, in her words, a rich feminist tradition of thinking about motherhood that was widely reviewed and recognized as groundbreaking. And she highlights certain books, the one I just referred to, Laura Umansky's Motherhood Reconceived, and Sharon Hayes' Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood. However, she argues that by 2000, the topic of motherhood had drifted to the margins of feminist studies. The leading feminist journal Science, for example, she notes, published a book review of 2 books on motherhood in 2009. Before that, the last time Science had reviewed a book on motherhood was 1998. So a full 10 years had gone by before another book, never mind an article, was reviewed on motherhood. She goes on to argue that the trickle of attention is in dramatic contrast to the previous decade. In the period 95 to 96, for example, Science published 3 review essays on motherhood studies, discussing in detail more than 30 titles. The sudden disappearance of motherhood, she said, did not just occur in Science. In 1999, Frontiers, also a leading journal, published a special issue on mothering and maternalism. The next time a feminist journal offered a similarly themed issue was the fall of 2009, when Women's Studies Quarterly did an issue on motherhood. So again, 10 years have lapsed before motherhood became a topic of a journal. She goes on to say that after searching the Women's Studies International Index for the 2000s, she says, I found a surprising paucity of critical essays, studies, or book reviews on the topic of motherhood. In addition, she laments that when she was the director of one PhD program in women and gender studies in the mid-2000s, she could not, and I quote, recall receiving a single graduate application on the proposed study of motherhood. Now, so this is what she's telling me, and I'm wondering if I'm just paranoid or whether this is happening. So, spring, summer of 2016, I undertook with my research assistant a study of the representation of motherhood in 4 women's studies venues. As I said, they were panels presented at this annual conference in the NWSA between 2:10 and 15, articles and book reviews in 5 feminist journals, and they are the leading ones: Science, Frontiers, Women's Studies, Quarterly, Feminist Studies, and Gender and Society, from 2:05 to 2:15. Then I looked at the table of contents of the leading 10 introductory to gender and women's studies textbooks, published over the last 10 years. And then I looked at the syllabi of 50 introduction to women's studies courses. So I'm going to throw some numbers at you. The detail I don't think is important, but I hope the overall message is. So, the breakdown of papers at the NWSA annual conference is as follows. The year 215, 506 papers with 18 on motherhood. 214, 593 papers with 29 on motherhood. 213, 767 with 24 on motherhood. 212, 741 with 10 on motherhood, and 3 on maternal. And 211 finally, 757 with 19 on motherhood. Overall, we use search terms to search their database of mothering, maternal, and so forth. Overall, 105 papers were presented on motherhood from a total of 3,364 papers, or less than 3%. More popular topics included activism, 118, transnationalism, 193, race, 216, queer gender, 156, queer, trans and queer, 156, and gender at 70. Thus, more than twice as many papers on transnational issues were presented than on motherhood, and twice as many papers on race than motherhood. And combining the topics of trans, queer, and gender studies, more than twice as many papers were on gender and sexuality than were presented on motherhood. Less than 3%, I would suggest, is far too low, given that, first of all, 80% of women become mothers at some time in their lives, and far too low, given that women's studies is at least an established academic field as transnational studies and sexuality studies. Yet there was twice as many papers in these fields than there were on motherhood. Moreover, and quite shockingly, to my knowledge, there has only been one plenary panel on mothering in the NWSA's history in 2006. I know that because I was on the panel. And there has never been a motherhood scholar or motherhood activist as a keynote speaker in the organization's 45 plus year history. And it gets worse. Similar low percentages are found in the number of articles and book reviews on motherhood in the leading gender and women's studies journals. Again, I take from January 1, 2006 to December 31st, 2016. The percentage of articles and book reviews on motherhood are as follows. For Signs, only 3% of their articles and book reviews were on motherhood. Frontiers, it was 6%. Feminist Studies, it was 1.6%. Women's Studies, it was 4%. And Gender Studies, 5%. In contrast, again using search engine, the percentage for the topics on sex and sexuality are 11, 5, 10, 4, 11, and for gender 17, 8, 9, 6, and 31. While the combined total for sex and sexuality are 41 and 71, the total for motherhood is 19.6. So 41, 71 versus 19.6. The average percentage, we'll break it all down, as I said, was 3.92 for motherhood, 8.2 for sex and sexuality, and 14.2 for gender. Thus, there were more than twice as many reviews on the reviews or articles on the topic of sex and sexuality, and close to 4 times as many reviews or articles on gender than motherhood. It gets worse. The percentage of motherhood content is even lower in Introduction to Women's Studies, Gender and Women's Studies textbooks. And again, we did a search and tried to get a sense what 10 were being used, and it's largely North American. Yeah, it would be North American. So what were the 10 books most used in Intro to Women's Studies classrooms between 2001 and 2016? So we look at the table of contents. None of the reviewed 10 books published in those 10 years have a section on motherhood. The absence is particularly noticeable in such textbooks, recent 2016, as Everyday Women in Gender Studies, which has no section on motherhood, but includes the chapter, The Manly Art of Pregnancy. And Feminist Frontiers likewise has no section on motherhood, but includes the chapter, Masculinities and Globalization. Now, 4 textbooks did have a section on the family, so that was a bit encouraging, but a closer look suggests otherwise. Only 4 of the approximately 25 chapters in these family sections cover the topic of motherhood. The most discussed topics in these family sections are heterosexuality and gender. Interestingly, and worrisome, there are as many chapters on fathering as there are on mothering in the family sections, even though it is mothers, not fathers, who do the overwhelmingly do care work in families. As well, the topic of motherhood as opposed to fatherhood is represented and regarded as an established field of considerable research. Thus, I think one would expect to find more scholarship on motherhood than fatherhood in these family sections. Now, 6 of the collections have chapters on motherhood, so that's kind of encouraging. However, all but one of the chapters was under 13 pages in length. The page count for the above 9 chapters is under 100 pages. These 9 chapters, along with the 4 in the family section, make a total of 13 chapters on motherhood. At approximately, and I did count them, combined page count of 150 pages of a total of 5,100, The percentage of motherhood in these 10 introductory textbooks is under 3%. And finally, it gets worse. An even lower percentage of motherhood content is found in the 50 Introduction to Women and Gender Studies courses that we examined. And this was even particularly surprising because we sent out a call for this. You can't go on websites and access course outlines anymore. They're copyright protected. So because we sent it out, we thought we would get a more favorable response because, you know, they saw the email address, and I thought we'd get more people saying, yes, I do motherhood, please include me. So I think it's worse than this, actually. So 10 of the 50 courses included at least one reading on the topic of motherhood. So this initial count of 10 suggests a percentage of 20%. However, digging deeper, something else is suggested. The perspective of many of these courses that do have motherhood is that of reproductive rights and justice. Now, I'm not against reproductive rights and justice. It's important and necessarily, but reproductive rights and justice is not the same thing as talking about mothering, necessarily. Interestingly, 3 of the courses in which motherhood is examined, the reading is lesbian or black motherhood. And again, that must be talked about, and I do it in my teaching. But I worry here it was more about the race and the sexuality than about motherhood. They were meeting their quota. Only one of the 10 courses has a full unit of motherhood, in which motherhood is examined from more than one single perspective, i.e. lesbian or black, and from more than a reproductive rights paradigm. But interestingly, you may not know the history of this, but I can share it later. But interestingly, this unit includes an interview with Rebecca Walker, a feminist writer well known for her mother blame perspective. So the one reading that might be there is written by someone who is celebrated and renowned for her mother blaming. In addition to the 10 courses that had at least one reading on motherhood, 2 of the courses did have readings on the family, so again there was some hope. However, the themes of the family sections were not motherhood, largely. They were gender and the family, family life systems, marriage and love. In total, the 50 course syllabi contain hundreds of readings, but I would argue that less than 10 of these are specifically on mothering from a mother's point of view. That is roughly less than 1%. So the percentage of motherhood content in women's studies conferences, journals, textbooks, and syllabi range from under 1% to just under 4%. Now, as I said, given that 80% of women become mothers in their lifetime, there is an evident disconnect between the minimal representation of motherhood in academic feminism and the actual lives of most women. Indeed, as Eva Feder-Kitty emphasizes, most women care for dependents at some point, and for some women, she says, this occupies the better part of their lives. Moreover, as I said, these low percentages do not reflect or capture the considerable and significant research done in motherhood over the last 20 years. Okay, the baby out with the bathwater. Reasons for the exclusion of motherhood in academic feminism, and this is my last section, and it's speculative. I have attempted to make sense of the disappearance of motherhood in academic feminism in the 21st century. Now, the demand for a theory and practice based on a specific identity of women is hardly an innovative or radical claim. Over the last 40 plus years, many groups of women have argued that mainstream feminism, largely understood to be liberal feminism, has not adequately represented their perspective or needs. Women of color, for example, have advocated that feminism addressed intersexuality of their oppression as racialized women, a feminism now known as womanism. Women from the global south have called for the development of a theory of global feminism, and queer, lesbian, bi, and trans women have supported the growth of queer feminist theory and activism. Likewise, the development of third-wave feminism in the 1990s grew out of young women's dissatisfaction and sense of alienation from second-wave feminism, so a new feminism was created and included third wave. When such women demanded a feminist theory of their own, the larger feminist movement acknowledged, albeit often reluctantly, that these women had been excluded from the larger canon of feminist thought. Feminist theory was subsequently revised to include these different positions and perspectives within feminism. Most introduction to women's studies textbooks or courses now include chapters on socialist feminism, global feminism, queer feminism, third wave feminism, and these perspectives and topics are represented at women's studies conferences and in women's studies journals. Moreover, as I document in the above study, many topics relevant to the experience of racialized, poor, transnational, queer, young women are examined in women's studies conferences, journals, and textbooks. However, as mothers began to call for feminism for and about mothers over the last decade or so, what I have defined as matricentric feminism, and to ask for its inclusion in academic feminism, their calls were not met with the same respect or recognition. More often than not, their claims are dismissed, trivialized, disparaged, and ridiculed. Why would mothers need a mother-centered feminist perspective? The question implies that mothers do not have needs or concerns separate from their larger identity of women. It troubles me deeply that feminists are able to understand the intersectionality of gender oppression when it comes to race, class, sexuality, but not so for maternity. But I would argue, and I suspect most mothers would agree, that maternity needs to be likewise understood in terms of intersectional theory. The category of mother, as I said earlier, is distinct from the category of women, and the problems mothers face, social, political, and so on, are specific to their work and identity as mothers. Indeed, as I said, mothers, arguably so, more so than women, remain disempowered despite 40 years of feminism. Mothers, in other words, do not live simply as women, but as mother women. Just as black women do not live simply as women, but as racialized women. Moreover, mothers' oppression and resistance under patriarchy are shaped by their maternal identity, just as black women's oppression and resistance are shaped by their racialized identity. Thus, it seems obvious to me that mothers need a feminism of their own that understands this intersectionality, and to position mothers' concerns as a starting point for a theory and politic of empowerment. For me, as I said, this just seems self-evident. Why then is maternity not understood to be a subject position and hence not theorized as with other subject positions in terms of the intersectionality of gender oppression and resistance? Why do we not recognize women's specific perspectives as we do for other women, whether they're queer, working class, or racialized? Why do mothers and mothering not count or matter? Going back to Kawash, the article I mentioned earlier, she says this: the marginalization of feminist thought over the last 15 years was a political rejection of assumed maternal politics as a backlash to feminism, and the result of deep upheavals in feminist theory. She argues, as I said earlier, by the 1990s, difference feminism has been eclipsed and was no longer a serious topic of discussion in feminist graduate programs or in the academic feminist press. The deconstruction of woman and the post-structuralist accounts of gender and power, she continues, left motherhood to the side, an embarrassing theoretical relic of an earlier naive view of the essential woman and her shadow, the essential mother. Now, building on Kawash's argument, I argue that it's more precisely a misreading of maternity in matricentric feminism that has resulted in the disappearance of motherhood in and by academic feminism. More specifically, I contend that academic feminism confuses mothering with motherhood and conflates matricentric feminism with gender essentialism. Okay, so just to go on with my speculations. Building on Patrice DeQuenso, an amazing maternal scholar from the late 90s, she has this concept of the dilemma of difference. Now, I consider, using this idea of the dilemma of difference, how academic feminists enact confusion and conflation and erasure in their understanding of motherhood. And in so doing, academic feminism has indeed thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Okay, I'm near the end. Confusing mothering with motherhood. It is my view that the earlier negative stance on motherhood and the current disappearance of motherhood in academic feminism is the result of a larger and pervasive feminist discomfort with all things maternal, and more specifically, the result of confusing the institution of motherhood with the experience of mothering. Much of second-wave feminism, in particular that of liberal and radical libertarian feminism, viewed motherhood as a significant, if not the determining cause of women's oppression under patriarchy. As Rosemary Putnam Tong notes in her book, in her collection Feminist Thought, Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique, which is a central liberal feminist text, advised women to become like men. The now infamous quote from the feminist mystique, "The problem that has no name," quickly became a trope for the dissatisfaction supposedly felt by stay-at-home mothers. Friedan says this, in lieu of more meaningful goals, these women spent too much time cleaning their already tidy homes, improving their already attractive appearances, and indulging their already spoiled children. Moreover, she goes on to say that contemporary women need to find meaningful work in the full-time paid labor force. Along these lines, radical libertarian Shulamith Firestone claims the material basis for the sexual political ideology of female submission and male domination is rooted in the reproductive roles of men and women. And she says this, and it's a bit of a doozer. No matter how much educational, legal, and political quality women achieve, and no matter how many women enter public industry, nothing fundamental will change for women as long as natural reproduction remains the rule and artificial or assisted reproduction the exception. Natural reproduction is neither in women's best interest nor in those of the children so reproduced. The joy of giving birth, evoked so frequently in this society, is a patriarchal myth. In fact, pregnancy is barbaric, and natural childbirth is at best necessary and tolerable, and at worst, it's like shitting a pumpkin. So I think that's kind of self-evident. For Friedan and Firestone, motherhood is a patriarchal institution that causes women's oppression, and thus, the feminist solution is to disavow and denounce motherhood. However, as motherhood scholars and mothers alike have rightly argued, and we've done it, such reasoning is deeply flawed in its failure to take into account the important difference between the institution of motherhood and women's experience of mothering. Now, if you haven't read Of Woman Born, you must. She is the mother of maternal scholarship, and in her, I call it ovarian work, not seminal, in her ovarian work Of Woman Born, she distinguishes between two meanings of motherhood, one superimposed on the other. The potential relationship of any woman to her powers of reproduction and to children, and the institution which aims at assuring that potential and all women shall remain under male control. So what this means is the term motherhood refers to the patriarchal institution of motherhood, which yes, is male defined and controlled, and yes, is deeply oppressive to women. Whereas the word mothering refers to women's experience of mothering, and it is female defined and potentially empowering to women. The reality of patriarchal motherhood thus must be distinguished from the possibility or potentiality of empowered feminist mothering. And this is what Rich says. To critique the institution, therefore, is not an attack on the family or on mothering, except as defined and restricted under patriarchy. In other words, whereas motherhood as an institution is male-defined and is a site of oppression, women's own experience can be a source of mothering, can be a source of power. It has long been recognized among scholars of motherhood that Rich's distinction between mothering and mothering was what enabled feminists to recognize that motherhood is not naturally, necessarily, or inevitably oppressive. Rather, mothering freed from motherhood could be experienced as a site of empowerment and as a location of social change if, to use Rich's words, women become outlaws from the institution of motherhood. However, much of academic feminism, this crucial distinction and the difference between the institution and the experience is not recognized or understood. As a result, mothering becomes confused with motherhood, and maternity is regarded solely and exclusively as a patriarchal entity. Okay, my last speculation. Conflating matricentric feminism with maternalism and gender essentialism. So what is maternalism? Again, it is not in and of itself problematic, it's often used problematically. So what maternalism suggests or states that mother knows best, that women as a group maintain a set of beliefs or experiences that reflect their sort of innate motherly knowledge and motherly strengths. Maternalism suggests that women are or should be the moral conscience of humanity and asserts women's legitimate investment in political affairs through this emphasis. And matricentric feminism, well, realizing the importance of this and the use of this in some ways, is largely critical of this essential view that only women can be mothers and that it's somehow innate to us, and only to us. Matricentric perspective is not to be confused, as I said, with the maternalist one. What matricentric feminism, as I mentioned earlier in my list, of course it asserts its importance, but it understands mothering to be socially and historically constructed, and positions mothering as a practice rather than strictly just an identity. Central to much of matricentric feminism is in fact a critique of the maternalist stance that maternity positions maternity as only that women can do. It challenges the assumption that maternity is simply natural to all women. It sees mothering, as I said, as a culturally constructed practice of importance, but one that is cultural and should be shared not just by the biological mother, but by all who care about children, including fathers in the community. Therefore, although matricentric feminism does hold a matrifocal perspective and insists that mothering does matter, it does not advance what I see as a somewhat problematic essentialist maternalist agenda. However, matricentric feminism, in its focus on a gendered experience, that of mothering, and of course the related ones of pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding, does force us to address the thorny issue of gender difference. As noted above, feminist theory, with the notable exception of difference feminism, positions gender difference as central to, if not the cause of women's oppression. Liberal feminists advocate what has been called sameness feminism, wherein women become more like men. Radical libertarian feminists promote androgyny, and post-structuralist feminists seek to destabilize and deconstruct gender difference altogether. Indeed, as one critic notes, challenging biological determinism and other essentialisms has been a crucial policy strategy for feminists. Thus, because feminists are uncomfortable that anything that underscores gender difference and suggests essentialism, like women are naturally this way, men are naturally that, motherhood becomes problematic, as it, more than anything else, is what marks gender difference. Only biological females can become biological mothers. And because gender difference is seen as structuring and maintaining male dominance, many feminists seek to downplay or disavow anything that marks this difference, the main one, of course, being motherhood. For many feminists, to call attention to women's specific gender subjectivities of mother is to subscribe to an essentialist view, acknowledging and affirming what is seen as marking and maintaining gender difference and hence the oppression of women. Indeed, as Julie Stevens says, who was actually at the Melbourne Symposium, and her book, Confronting Postmaternal Thinking, the primary focus of the second wave feminist movement has been one long struggle against essentialism, whether that be biological, cultural, or ideological. That makes any discussion linking women with care or mothering and nurture particularly troubling. And as she goes on to say, any activism done in the name of the maternal will be unsettling, particularly those who perceive feminism as primarily a struggle against essentialism. Just to finish up, I agree that gender is not constructed. Sex does not equal gender, or Simone de Beauvoir once said, one is not born a woman but made one. And thus people cannot define themselves or limit their lives to what is socially constructed by gender. However, I likewise believe that feminists should not disavow motherhood to facilitate this disabling of gender. I believe it is possible, albeit difficult, to simultaneously argue that gender is constructed and that motherhood matters, and that maternity is integral to a mother-woman's sense of self. In my view, the apprehension over gender difference is the elephant in the room of academic feminism. It has shut down necessary and needed conversations about important and, yes, gender dimensions of women's lives: menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, and mothers. Mothers can no longer, I know this firsthand, talk about their reproductive identities and experience without being called an essentialist. But maternal scholars do not reduce women's sense of self to motherhood, nor do they say that this is what makes her a woman or that motherhood is more important than any of the variables that constitute self. They say simply that motherhood matters and it is central and integral to the understanding of women's lives as women as mothers. Hardly a radical claim. Okay, to conclude. quoting again from Kawash, "Motherhood studies is an area of scholarship, is on precarious grounds, ignored by mainstream academic feminism, fragmented and discontinuous in the academic margins." In making this argument, it was quite interesting. When I read this article, unknown to me, she used actually the example of my university shutting down ARM, the precursor to Mercy, and refusing to fund it. In making, she says this, York University's refusal to provide institutional funding for the Association for Research on Mothering and the resulting close of the association in 2010 writes, "The fact that neither the university system nor the Institution of Academic Feminism appears willing to support a scholarly community and research program that explicitly foregrounds mothering is discouraging." However, she goes on to argue that the fact is, even before York pulled the plug, the established academic community completely ignored the work of ARM. Neither O'Reilly's work nor the Demeter volumes were reviewed in any significant feminist journal, and JARM, our journal at the time, has few institutional subscribers. Thus, Kawash writes, while motherhood has been an energizing topic in the past decade, there has been little a boundary crossing movement between academic and popular discussions, and the movement between feminist studies and motherhood studies has been only in one direction. She says this as well. Feminist theorists, scholars and writers, as well as feminist mother activists, have a lot to say to each other and a lot to learn from each other about motherhood. Motherhood studies needs the perspectives and commitments of feminism, as well as the institutional resources that feminism and women's studies have accumulated over the past several decades. At the same time, feminism cannot possibly hope to remain relevant without acknowledging motherhood in all of its contradictions and complexities. Indeed, in the words of, again, Patrice de Quenzio, to the extent that mothering in all its diverse forms remains an important aspect of women's lives, and that decisions about whether, when, and how to mother continue to face almost all women, feminism cannot claim to give an adequate account of women's lives and to represent women's needs and interests if it ignores the issues of mothering. Now, in this paper, I've discussed the disavowal of motherhood in 20th century feminism and documented its disappearance in 21st. As well, I've suggested possible explanations for this disappearance, the confusion of mothering and motherhood, and the conflation of matricentric feminism with gender essentialism. However, despite the disavowal and disappearance of motherhood in academic feminism, we do have a feminist theory and movement of our own. But matricentric feminism must be more than acknowledged as a legitimate, viable, and independent school of thought. It must be integrated into mainstream academic feminism. But how do we accomplish this? We need more women doing motherhood scholarship and more mother professors in the academy. We demand that matricentric feminism have a chapter of its own, as do other schools of feminist theory, whether they be queer, global, womanist, in our feminist theory readers. That introduction to women's studies courses and textbooks include sections on motherhood. That women's journals and conferences include more papers on motherhood, and that more books on motherhood are reviewed in journals. We must also continuously challenge the conflation of mothering with motherhood within academic feminism, as well as counter the association of matricentric feminism with gender essentialism. And decisively and urgently, we must interrupt the received narrative of academic feminism, in particular its normalization of the genderless and autonomous subject, in order to foreground the centrality of women's reproductive identities and lives, and the importance of care in our larger culture. Indeed, as Anne Mary Slaughter comments, the bottom line message is that we are never going to get gender equality between men and women unless we value the work of care as much as we value paid work. That's the unfinished business. Finally, and most importantly, we must demand that matricentric feminists be recognized and respected as the feminists that they indeed are, and that their feminism, that of matricentric feminism, have a room of its own in the larger home of academic feminism. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Hillary.
I actually have two questions. So I'm not a researcher, I'm just just a woman. I'm a mother.
Don't just say that.
Sorry, I'm a woman and a mother. And look, when reading mass media and the commodification of sort of pregnancy and babies and celebrity
Oh yeah.
have had a detrimental effect to this matricentric feminism.
Yes, in fact, that's a whole other, I think we've got half a dozen publications in the Demeter catalog. Yes, because, that's a good question and a long answer. Most definitely, because when I often talk about this, they say, what are you talking about? Motherhood's everywhere. You know, you're just paranoid, right? But that's not us, right? Yes, and celebrity magazines and a lot of, television shows, sure, there's a lot about motherhood. But that's, first of all, it's the institution of motherhood. And it's either horribly idealized or horribly disparaged. That the real, what I call the messy, muddled mess of motherhood is rarely represented in popular discourse, whether they be magazines, television shows. So this celebrity version, I think, is the sanitized, idealized view of motherhood. That I think has been particularly detrimental to mothers, because the view that they present of mothers is not attainable. It's not even attainable by those women because they're all photoshopped anyway, right? So, and never mind that they have, we all know there's trainers and chefs and nannies and nursemaids and cooks and cleaners and laundress. Of course, but mothers often, and I've certainly felt that way. I mean, I had my children thankfully a bit before this, celebrity momism, but I still remember feeling very inadequate. I'd be standing in line and at the checkout at the supermarket, and some celebrity would say, "My baby woke me up at 3 a.m. this morning, and I've never felt more happy or defined." And I'm in line with a screaming 2-year-old, right, who needs a nap. So yeah, I think you're right. It's everywhere, but it's also invisible, and that's what makes it kind of difficult to talk about this. Yeah, motherhood's everywhere, but it's not our mothering. It's either, as I said, completely idealized, that makes us feel guilty and ashamed and anxious, or it's disparaged, that makes us look over the shoulder and wondering when we're going to be caught out as that bad mom. Does that answer that?
Yeah. So can I ask?
Oh yeah, certainly.
Also, the decline of the birth rate in the first world and increasing age of first-time mothers seen as another reason for the decline in matricentric.
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. I mean, we are seeing a decline everywhere pretty well. I mean, there's been some exceptions, but yes. And in fact, the countries like Italy, for example, has the lowest birth rate, which is, has been a Catholic country which had the highest birth rates. I think several things are going on. I think one thing is the delaying of adulthood, right? When you had kids 40 years ago, they say you're going to be a mother till you're 18. And my students will say, well, if you have a baby, you're committed for 18 years, and I have to just laugh. I said, no, it's forever now, right? And that's not faulting those children, right? It takes us longer to have whatever it means to be an adult, financial security or, a job, and that's just, of course, getting worse every hour. So I think we've delayed adulthood. So in Canada, for example, in Toronto, the average age of first-time mothers is now 30. And 20 years ago, it was, under 24. Now, if you're under 24, you're now a young mother and at risk, right? So part of it is that, but I think part of it, women are voting with your uteruses. We have made it so difficult for women to mother. They are not supported by anybody. And in many countries, certainly in Canada, mothers have to be in the paid labor force. In Canada, 72% of mothers are in the paid labor force, with children under the age of 5. And that's not because they're materialistic and they want a new car in their driveway. The reality is in Canada, to have even a semblance of middle-class lifestyle, you need 2 incomes, or you've had to find and marry, a tech guy, right, who makes $150,000 at 24. I mean, who makes that type of money when you're starting a family? No one I know. So I think part of it is, in more and more Western countries, they rely on 2 incomes to have a middle-class lifestyle. And in fact, the stats are staggering in Canada. If those women withdrew from the paid labor force, the rates of poverty would double. They're not working for pin money. They're working to pay the mortgage and, to put food on the table. So I do think it's hard enough to be a mother, and it is, with no support, no recognition, no validation, no respect in many cases. And it's even, I think you add to that the reality that most women must combine paid work with mother work in a society that does nothing to help them. and often families where men do nothing to help them in that work. So I agree with you. I mean, I think, but interestingly though, the majority of women still become mothers globally. It's still 80%. But the difference is they're having fewer children and they're coming to mothering later. But it's still high. I mean, it's still 80% average. Now, I would argue if you just looked at the West, that would probably be lower because it's factored in with other countries. But I still think in the West, it's, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you could, if you're a stats person, you could tease out those numbers. But it's still the majority of women in the West still become mothers. And I would say probably overwhelming majority. But you wouldn't know that if you walked into a women's studies classroom. You wouldn't know that if you picked up a women's studies journal. You wouldn't. Motherhood is not talked about in these classrooms or in these journals or at these conferences. Yet other issues are talked about, right, that affect, you know, some women, but they're still included. But motherhood is not. Generally, there are exceptions, and thankfully there are exceptions. Anybody? Oh, yes.
I'm also not an academic, I'm an activist, and I founded a social enterprise called Lead Mama Lead, which is about promoting equality of opportunity for working mums, with the belief that we should be able to have great careers and have the care work time, and that dads should get that too. And I just wanted to make a comment about the frustration I've felt about motherhood being treated as a lifestyle decision and not something that happens to most women, and that we need to grapple with the fact that most women want to have a career, they want to have that public economic satisfaction outside the home, and that we haven't transformed the workplace to go along with that.
No, and you know what, I you know, people always say, you know, well, why do mothers want to work? And I say the same reason fathers want to work, right? I mean, out of an economic necessity, but not in many cases because a full life often means many things. Work, mothering, friends, leisure, activism. So you're absolutely right. We've made it almost impossible for women to do both successfully. But you can do both successfully with radical change. Well, not even radical change. Just a little bit of change would help, right? Evolved fathers, for we all know the stats, they're really depressing. Fathers are not doing their fair share. And we need more engaged fathers. We need workplaces that, you know, have flex time, have remote work. And in Canada, and in Australia too, but this has been our fight, we need something called universal childcare. You know? So I do think it's doable. I mean, I'm having, I guess, a successful career. I have 3 children. I have 3 children 5 years. I started my PhD with a 2-year-old 6 months pregnant. And they turned out all right, I guess. You know, they haven't grown 2 heads anyway. But the warning was you can't do both. And I said, yes, you can do both, but we have to make it, we have to give the societal support. And women are doing both, but they're killing themselves, right? So we really need more engaged co-parents, whether they be lesbian couple or heterosexual couple, and we need public policy and workplace change. And it is happening, but it's incremental.
And it's hard for dads to get the flexibility.
Oh, yeah.
It's really hard. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting, Ken, to mention that, because what's interesting though with, I know Australia, you're almost as bad as the States, but not quite, and that's nothing really to aspire towards. I mean, the United States doesn't have any maternity leave. 0. None. They get 6 weeks unpaid, but it's under a medical, like a thing, not. Canada, we do have, and the Norwegian countries, Scandinavian countries have had this for a long time. We do have, Canada's a very generous, we call mat leave, but it's really parental leave. And in Canada, you can be divided up, and you know, the woman can take, let's say, the first 4 months, and or the next 6, and he takes 4, whatever. I'm using he, but it can be a same-sex, non-biological, the non-pregnant person, if you will. What they've discovered, though, it's really shocking. It is available to men with no penalty. They get 80% of their pay. It's flexible. It's alarming how few men take it. I think it's under 5%. It's there. It's available. There's no penalties. You're guaranteed your job. When you come back, you get 80% of your pay, just like the woman would. Men are not taking it. So I agree, but I think it's more than about that. I think it's about masculinity, that real men don't stay home with babies. Real men work. And I know many couples where she took the full year. And interestingly, in this case, they were both teachers. And I'm thinking, well, why didn't you do the first 6? And and their salaries were the same. You do the first 6, because I can understand. And in fact, the Leave in Canada, some of it is dedicated just to the pregnant person, because that means recovering from birth, right? Establishing breastfeeding. And that's, I think, 3 months. The woman must take that. The other 7 months or whatever, or 8 months, can be divided as that couple wishes. They can be home at the same time, it can be staggered. Men are not taking. So what they've done in Quebec, our province in Quebec, they have a different legal system, and they've done it in Scandinavian countries, it's called use it or lose it. It's just for men. If they don't take it, the woman can't. They have seen noticeable increases. So this is what we have to do, use it or lose it. Because if we make it leave, women are just going to keep taking it. And yes, I mean, you could say so what, but I think men need to be there in the early years. You know, mothering is not natural. Mothering is learned. I mean, some women said they had it at birth. You know, when I took my son home from the hospital, I was 23 years old and I was terrified. And I remember saying, they're letting you walk out with him? I have no idea what I'm doing. And I became a good enough mother. I learned. And if men are there in the, I hate to use that metaphor, it's militaristic, but in the trenches, men will become good fathers too. You only learn by doing, but men become involved so much later, the patterns have been established. So baby cries, it expects mom, and mom goes to baby. And I think if we are, from the ground, at the beginning, men are involved, or the other co-parent, whoever they may be, they will actually learn mothering just like women learn it. And it is a skill. I don't like saying it's instinct or innate, because that de-skills it. We become good mothers because we work really, really hard at it. And we learn through trial and error. And there's a lot of errors. Right? Probably become a good mother by your 3rd, right? Maybe, right? So, but thank you for that. I do think it's, you know, but what's frustrating, that is so prevalent in our lives. And nice to see you, Vivek.
You too,
Is that this affects all women, but it's not in any women's studies classrooms. It's not talked about at their conferences. I find that shocking. Because we want to talk about it. Did anybody else? Yes.
I've got a question here, and then one here, and over here. And the aircon's gone off. I wish I could fix that.
We're taking up more space.
I really like the fact that you say mothering is not innate. I don't like the celebrity motherhood brings in the cult of the mother goddess and the mother, and somehow we can do things that men apparently.
But, you know, that's what I'm always told. Well, nobody reads the stuff because we're against maternalism or against gender essentialism. And I just think that's a cop-out. They're not reading it, right? I mean, anybody who's been to any one of our conferences or any other motherhood conference, they know flat out that's not what we're doing, right? So, and that's why when I frame it, I really talk about mothering as practice rather than as calling, right? Mothering as work rather than as identity. That it is something that is absolutely essential to our culture, valuable, necessary, and we need more people doing it. And it needs to be respected and supported. But I do agree, I mean, we had this whole discussion, we'll turn it into parenting. Parenting's feminism. Well, to parent is different than to mother, we know that. And Sarah Raddick once said, she's passed away, she said, in an ideal world we could use gender neutral world, like parent. But she says the reality is women still do the bulk of it. And until that changes, we have to use the word mother, because otherwise we're being disingenuous. It is women still do the bulk. But she's very clear that when she says men can do and should mother. So she's really trying to extricate it from biology. I know it's hard though, but parenting studies is not the same as motherhood studies. To parent means something very different than to mother. So we don't have a word for it. I wish we did have a gender neutral word that worked. But right now we have parent, and caregiving isn't quite the same either. Right? So you're right, we need that world. And that's why I kind of joined matricentric, because I was really trying to think it was focused on the work of mothering and the importance of mothering without reducing it to maternalism. I don't know if it's working, but it's my struggle to foreground the importance, but to also de-gender.
Someone over back.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry.
And someone over here.
I'd like to point out that I think you use 2 very problematic phrases. And one is that men need to do their fair share of childcare. Now nobody says that somebody needs to do their fair share of eating the caviar.
No, true.
So why would you say that someone has to do their fair share of mothering? Because it really implies that mothering is a very unpleasant task.
So what's happened here?
You use that
No, I know,
phrase.
just what type of task? I didn't hear.
Unpleasant.
Oh, unpleasant task. Oh,
And maybe it is unpleasant.
yeah, at times, but not always.
Because it's very isolated
Yeah.
and unvalued and unculturally supported. And the other phrase that you use that I think is problematic is that your children turned out.
I know, I did that one.
I think that's really problematic because it's incredibly important to look at the experience of children and value it as it goes from babyhood to toddlerhood to childhood. And if they turn out okay, that doesn't validate lying in a creche crying for hours, being quintuplet with, one person looking after 5 kids.
No, I agree. I agree. First thing, I do that rhetorically because I've often told, and I have been told, that a feminist and a woman with a career, her kids are going to grow up, be deranged, and I really have been told that. I was told time and time again, your kids are going to pay for this. They're going to pay. There is no correlation. There have been women who've been devoted stay-at-home mothers and have given their life to children and their kids committed suicide, tragically. There are women, so I use that. I really have, I agree with you, and I'm sorry if I sound flippant. Yes, we can devote our lives to our children and things can go terribly wrong and that's not our fault. There are good children of bad mothers, whatever that means, and there's children of bad children of good mothers. There's no correlation. We want to think there is. We want to believe that if we do everything right, everything will go right. And you might say that now with a toddler, an infant. When you have teenagers and adult children, it's a whole different. You've done everything right and things are going really, really bad. I know many women whose children have committed suicide, mothers, children with drug addictions, who are in prison, they were good mothers, right?
But you can be a good worker in a job and still get the same.
Exactly.
We all know that.
But nobody sees that with mothering.
Why talk
I know.
about
I know.
children in terms of how they turn out?
Yeah, but we do in a culture.
That really devalues them.
Yeah, of course it is, and it's individual's own agency, absolutely. And other variables. We know that, yes, mothering has a big part in how children come and grow, but not all. And in terms of the fair share, I mean that because, and I should have been more clear on that, men need to do more anyway, not just childcare. They need to do more domestic labor. They need to do more what I call homework. And I don't mean homework after school, I mean running a home, paying the bills, being there when the furnace guy shows up because your furnace is out. Men do not do that. In fact, what studies are showing, they are doing the fun stuff, right? So they're doing a bit more, but they're not doing the heavy lifting. They're not going to the doctor's appointments. They are taking the child to the zoo, or they are playing with their children. And in fact, one woman, there's lots on this, but one that stays with me, this one woman had a stay-at-home father. And she went back to work and she said, oh good. She came home and nothing had been done. And he said, what's home with the baby? And she said, you're not just home with the baby. You have to put a load of laundry in, you have to clean the floors, you have to pay the bills, you have to do the groceries. He said, no, I'm on pat leave, I'm just home with the baby. No, that's my point is, and it's becoming a bit of a problem. And a lot of men said, no, I'm home on pat leave, that's all I'm doing. No, mothering is more than about raising children. A hell of a lot more, right? It's about homework, home maintenance, what they actually call the third shift now, about creating meaning of family. It means Christmas, it means Thanksgiving, it means birthday parties, it means if Aunt Flo was sick in the hospital, you remember to send a card. That's the work that women do to maintain family and home and community. And men are not doing their fair share of that. There is no dispute in the evidence on that. So men need to do both the joy and the heavy lifting of raising family and creating home. Yes? Oh, sorry, yes, you were fine, Jan. Sorry, I apologize.
That's all right. I just wanted to make a comment on the role of single mothers who would prefer their estranged partners not to have any role with children. And the other was the complexity of the mother role. Where do you look at the interdisciplinary side of things like endocrinology and hormones? Where do you separate the research that is being done on child development now from a neurological point of view, looking at the first 1,000 days and things like that, there's a kind of intrinsic sort of
Yeah, it's there, and and actually the conference, that Petra said or the symposium on Monday, she said that one thing about motherhood, it does sit uncomfortably at the threshold of biology and culture. It does, right? I'm not arguing that, of course it does, but I think we've looked too much at the biological, often at the expense of cultural. And we've often seen this most with postpartum depression. I've been at many conferences, and all the experts are saying it's her hormones are out of whack. And I said, well, it might be that, but it might be because she's trapped on a 23rd floor of an apartment for 12 hours a day on poverty, income, and there's a snowstorm in Canada, and she has been outside for 4 days, and she has a colically infant and a screaming toddler. Right? Yes, it might be biology, but it could also, and that needs to change. But it's so easy to prescribe a pill and to change systemically what's causing her depression. Yes, of course, postpartum is biological, but I think that's a really good point. And of course, the child development stuff is important. But I guess my reservation is, I know it's important. Then why are we asking one woman just to do it? If we really believe all this literature, then we should have the best child care centers, we should have the most educated child care providers, we should do everything we can to maximize that brain development that they say is happening. And we don't. So I agree with you, but instead that's used against women. Oh, those first 5 years are so important. Don't do anything but stare at your child, right? So it's been used against women instead of an opportunity for real supportive mother work and child development. And it could be. So I agree with you. I think this is an opportunity to prove that children matter. And so let's as a society get it together and support those children to realize, what we say might be there in their potential brain growth.
Someone first
Yeah.
up here, and then someone,
You've
and then
touched
there's
on
someone
it
over here.
because I actually think postnatal depression in our society for some women is a healthy response to a terrible situation.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I'm not, no,
I know you do, that's what I'm
It's
saying.
like-
And I think we do medicalise and we
yeah.
treat them as hormonal women.
Yeah.
But the other thing we've got to really look at, and you talked about
Yeah.
two salaries and needing two salaries just to
Yeah.
survive. We've created that.
I know.
In the 1950s, one salary
Absolutely.
survived. We had more money, we spend more
Yeah.
money, we have more debt.
Yeah.
And we need to reinvent the
I
paradigm
agree.
of work. Because we freed women to work, we let them work now,
Now
we use it, but we in a male-dominated
Yep.
focus, not a female-dominated focus.
Well, I haven't talked about, this, another version of the paper I do, this has everything to do with something outside of us. I talk about the rise in neoliberalism and of course, the fact that we now need two incomes is not coincidental or accidental. Of course it's not. People are getting poorer globally, and middle class now is hugely precarious. There's precarious work, people have lost pensions, unionization rates are way down, people have to piece together there's no such thing as a real, lifetime job anymore. None of my friends, they all work in precarious work, right? No, benefits, with no seniority, with no stability, with no pensions, with no unions. So I agree, but how, that's a huge issue. To enable somebody to live off, in fact, most people can't even live off 2 wages. In Toronto right now, our minimum wage is lower than yours, but in Toronto now, to be at or above the poverty line, so we're not talking well off here, we're talking apartment and, basic food, you need to work 87 hours a week. Well, even 2 people can't work 87 hours a week at minimum wage. It takes 87 hours a week to push yourself above the poverty line. So something's very wrong. So usually it's 2 people, and they are working 84 hours, but there might be one here, one there, and then the commute time. I mean, I've been in Melbourne, it's like Toronto. It takes you an hour just to get to work. Never mind putting in your hours to work. So I agree, but what do we do? Until then, most families need 2 incomes to maintain a basic middle-class lifestyle, some financial security. And we're not talking about holidays in the Caribbean. We're not talking monster homes. There are that too. We're talking about basic. A home in Toronto, average home now costs $1.4 million. Okay, that's not a monster home. That's a house. So who has that type of down payment when you're 30 years old, right?
Oh, you got it.
So I'm, but I have a 21-month-old, and I'm in a situation where I don't work. But it's kind of like...
We don't work outside the home.
I don't work outside the home. Actually, I just have a uni student currently. is not important.
Right.
And it's really interesting when talking to someone and saying, one of the first things they will ask is, what do you do?
Yeah.
And it's really, some of it's awkward, it's kind of like, well, I don't have paid employment. And I feel like I have to justify saying then, well, I'm a uni student. And it's an interesting thing that there's so much focus on that you have to return to work. Yeah, and it makes you kind of like,
I agree with you. In fact, they call that the mommy wars, right, in the 90s and early 2000s, right?
it's just flip side.
But what's interesting too, I'll just say this briefly, that they have, you know, since the mummy wars is a media creation, they said if you actually look at women's lives, all women move in and out, right? Some women, you know, some women are home for a while, right? Then they might be back part-time. Then they might be full-time because their partner's lost their job. It is a false dichotomy. There's no such woman who's only in the paid labor force as a mother, and only a woman who's only home as a mother. That doesn't exist. And to say women are home, I don't even like that expression. Mothers who work with their children aren't anything but at home. They're everywhere, right? So it's a false dichotomy. And others who, again, we don't have the language with it. Because I don't want to say paid labor force because that makes it negative. You don't want to say at home because I think that's inaccurate. Those women have full, mothers do lots of stuff. I'm not justifying them. But it's erroneous to say they're at home. They're doing activism, they're volunteering at their schools, they're keeping the volunteer sector alive, many of them, in Canada. They say if those mothers pulled out, the whole culture would collapse in about a minute, right? So it's a false naming and it's a false dichotomy, I agree with you, completely. Yeah, sorry, somebody out there.
One over here and then one up here.
Okay.
First of all, congratulations for attacking such a difficult subject, and I can imagine that I've been looking at everyone's faces. This is a subject that we all feel very strongly about. So well done for wading in there and having an opinion. One of the things that I am interested in, and I would be interested in getting your opinion on this, is the post-structuralist disconnect between biology and womanhood. Now I know that you're separating motherhood from the institution of mothering from motherhood, but nevertheless, you know, motherhood or the business of giving birth and being pregnant and breastfeeding was traditionally associated with female bodies. So how do you see that changing now with post-structuralism?
Well, I agree with you because a part of this essentialism is also the absolute embodiment. I mean, I don't think academics generally are comfortable with embodiment, and particularly post-structuralists are not okay with embodiment, right? Gender is performed, gender is not embodied, gender is a practice, right? So it's really tricky, but of course it's embodied. But it doesn't have to be essential. You've got to almost keep these two things going. Of course, you know, our reproductive lives are embodied, and we need space to theorize that, you know, whatever, but we can't just reduce it to that. Do you see what I'm getting at, right? It is both. But academics are really uncomfortable with embodiment. They are heads on a stick. That's what it is. They are not okay with bodies, never mind maternal bodies. So that's a real issue in academia to begin with. And then a milky, leaking, bleeding body, it's like, oh, you know, no, I'm not. So I agree with you. So we need to create a space to theorize and honor that embodiment, but not reduce mothering. Because over the lifespan, in fact, that embodiment is about this much. We forget that because all the literature is on new moms. There's nothing on mothers of teenagers, nothing on mothers of adult children. So yes, embodiment is really big in the beginning, but if you add it over the lifespan, embodiment takes up a really minuscule of the maternal experience. I'm not minimizing it, but over time, it's just part of a larger journey. But we have to create space for it.
I absolutely agree with that, but what I'm getting at now is that women are being removed from that. That's being disconnected from womanhood. So what about...
Like the complete embodiment, like we're not supposed to be embodied, is that
Well,
what
we're not allowed to call women expecting mums. They are birthing parents.
Oh God, yeah. No.
Elephant root, yeah.
No, I completely, no. On that, I'm with you 100%. In fact, my daughters, this isn't about mothering, but my daughters are, you know, they're feminists and very active in social media. And there was one forum where they were not allowed even to say menstruation anymore. The women couldn't talk about menstruation because it was seen as essentialist and transphobic. And it was like, what? And they actually, it was, if you did, you'd put trigger warning. Might be offensive. So this is what I'm getting at. So, you know, we can talk about menstruation, be respectful of trans issues. And the thing is related to me, I know a lot of trans people, and they find this equally ludicrous. right? It's not the trans people saying this, it's people who are co-opting that perspective, right? In a really, I think, really worrisome way, to put through their own agenda, right? So I agree with you. We need to realize that we are embodied subjects, and we're vulnerable subjects. And we're not this autonomous, free-floating, self-sufficient head, right? So I agree with you. But you know, in academia, it's a hard sell.
Oh, yeah, well done.
You're not supposed to bleed or have milk or, you know, anything.
Okay, Holly then Belinda. I'm sorry.
I heard you say a lot about universal childcare. I'm wondering if you do or if you would ever advocate for universal at-home pay.
Absolutely.
The at-home pay.
Basic income.
Yes.
Yes.
We need basic income. Absolutely. I'm completely with you on that. We need both. I'm sorry, I mean, absolutely, I believe we need universal childcare. That's good and affordable, but we also, for many families, that isn't what they want, so we have a decent basic income. So they are two sides of the same, or we also have a bit of both. Like some women say, well, I don't work full-time, but can I have a minimum income? Because I might want to take 2 courses at university. Or I might want to work maybe part-time at this, you know, place. But the minute they do, now it's clawed back, as you know, 100%, right? So basic income and universal childcare, I think they're exactly the same. And you know what? They are also cost-effective. I'll give you an example in Quebec. Actually, we are launching basic income, a pilot project in Canada. It started last year, but just universal childcare in Quebec. We don't have it in the rest of Canada. Quebec, there's universal childcare. And it's regulated and blah, blah, blah. And there are problems with it. It's not as available in some places because Quebec can be a rural province. But it is now, I think it just went up to, it's $8 a day, $10 a day. And if you can't afford that, that's okay, it's subsidized. So initially, everybody said this is going to cause an economic collapse of Quebec. It is revenue neutral. It is not costing the province a cent. And you know why? Because more women are in the paid labor force, and there are women who want to be in the paid labor force, maybe not, but it seems that they are. And their taxes, in fact, and the higher taxes of the family, and the consumer spending, and all we know that, it is not, and this is not me, this was the business section of a right-wing newspaper in Canada, said the child care thing is revenue neutral in Quebec. It's not costing the taxpayers any money. And I think basic income would be the same thing, because the amount of money we're spending on determining whether somebody's eligible, and which category for how long, if we just say, here's the money, I think actually it costs less money. I don't like talking about it, I'm not a business person, but you have to talk their talk. And I think it wouldn't actually in the long run, it might cost a bit more, but the benefits we would get would be tenfold. In terms of better health, happier children, happier partnerships. All these people have time to be activists, right? That's why they don't give it though, because they know.
Andrea, I've really enjoyed listening to you tonight. Thank you so much.
Oh, there you are. Sorry. Sorry.
Disembodied voice.
Head on a stick. Head on a stick.
I'm a mother of a 1 and a 3-year-old, and I'm not an academic. But just, I guess, just some musings about what you've been saying about how locked out of the broader feminist world this way of thinking is, and what you were saying about your daughters online, not being able to discuss really basic matters about being a woman, which is actually isn't that taking feminism back to before feminism began, which was when women didn't have a voice?
I know. It really worries me, and I have to tread carefully because you won't make it construed a certain way, but it really concerns me that, I'm going to sound paranoid, but feminism did a lot. I mean, it had a lot of faults, but a lot of the dreams of the 60s became a reality in the 80s and 90s, right? And so my department, we had women's studies, but then it was changed to gender studies. I'm like, okay, that's fine, but we had 40 years. Could we not have had a bit longer? I mean, anthropology's been a discipline for 300 years, and political science for 700 years. It really worries me that we had a moment, and I think it was almost like, we've had it, girls, you've had it, go away, it's not important anymore. And you cannot really, I'm overstating it to make my point, but I've been doing this. You can't talk about these things in a lot of books.
But is it not women doing it to other women?
Yes, it is women doing it to other women. It's all women doing it to other women. There's men doing it too. But it is women saying to women, as I experienced when I tried to talk about mothering in my graduate feminist theories class, they said, stop being an essentialist. And the conversation ended. So, yes, it is women doing it to women. And I just don't understand why there's such Fear about talking about something that's just there. It's not that big of a deal. We're mothers, we're also other things. Right? I'm not saying it's going to replace everything. I'm not saying we only have to talk about that. But can we have one class on motherhood, a 26-week intro to women's studies class? Yes, can we have that? My daughter was in a class, and she was the one who told me this. This is 4 years ago. She took a 26-week, full 3 hours a day, and there was not one unit on motherhood. There was three weeks on trans issues, which is fine, but not motherhood. There was, several weeks on sexuality, right? There was several weeks on theory, but there also wasn't a week on domestic violence against women. There also wasn't, women in work. So we've become so theoretical that the actual lives of women in women's studies classes now are gone. Not all, but a lot of women's studies classes now have nothing to do with real women's lives. It's a theorization of gender, which is important, but I don't think it should replace abortion, mothering, violence, sexuality. If you look at it, that's another project I don't have time to, but I'd like to compare the women's studies content of a course, say, from 1980, then to compare one to 2017. They'd be radically different courses. Right? But they're not called women's studies anymore either. One's women's studies, one's women and gender studies. And I'm not saying that's not important work, don't get me wrong. We have lots to say about gender. And lots of important work needs to be done. But it's been at the expense of the disappearance of women and mothers.
So I believe we have our final question from here. Is
Yeah.
that right? Have I missed anyone up here? No.
Thank you very much. It's been a very fascinating presentation. I'm Indonesian. I'm a single mother. I have 2 children. I'm a PhD student here. And I'm also a diplomat. So I have all these different heads on my stick. Just to throw another something. I'm really interested in this whole matricentric feminism. But in the Indonesian case, the whole idea that a mother is defined by breastfeeding. The debate about essentialism, I think in my country doesn't really exist because we accept it as that's the way it is. But so I'm interested to see if there are, if you can place it within like a developing country's concept, because in my case, my children are not with me at the moment, but they're with my parents.
Right.
So I do have that family and social support at home, which I think is it's very important for everybody to be able to do that.
Yeah. Well, I think you make a really good point. I didn't talk about it enough because that's not what I was talking about. But what I did say that matricentric feminism is fundamentally defined by the recognition of cultural and and historical grounding. Because how mothering is viewed is of course not universal. They like to think it's universal. The good mother, where she is up there. But depending on time, place, culture, religion, it's radically different, right? So you must work. So with Demeter Press, for example, we've been very committed to this. We've published a book on South Asian mothering, East Asian mothering, Indigenous mothering, Muslim mothering. We've really tried to be that diverse because, and not just for tokenism, but to understand that the challenges and the supports are very, very different. So you have to, but I also think we also need to talk to each other across those differences, right? For support strategies, so on and so forth. But I think, we really need to be careful because women's studies initially had a problem, and we don't want to repeat it in motherhood studies. Talk about woman, right? Which they really meant white middle class, able-bodied, heterosexual. So, we're trying in motherhood studies to not do that, and it's this foregrounding of mothering as practice, and if that is culturally enacted, is a way to at least be cognizant of that and not to universalize mothering. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, I should just say, if you haven't already, please take a Demeter catalog, take a postcard, tell your library this matters, and if you're interested, the book is out there.
Yeah, thank you. I think we just need to thank Andrea very, very much.